Morning. It was the first coherent thought of the day, and Melondi groaned. The bed was warm, the covers reassuringly heavy, and the shaft of light peering in through her window was reassuringly dim. She rolled over in bed and opened one golden eye to peer balefully at the time on her omnipad. It wasn't quite 6. Her alarm would go off in a few minutes, and she closed her eyes again. There were occasional muted sounds of life in the corridor outside her room, but she rolled back on her side, scrunched down to draw her blanket up, and snuggled in. Winter was just around the corner, and the notion of getting up had no appeal. The air would be cool, the floor would be cold. Class wasn't for hours yet. Class. She was Melondi again, with Melondi's problems. That meant class. Thankfully, she only had humanity today. Most of her other classes fell on the second and third day of the week. She winced as the memory surfaced. The banquet in 5 days. It wasn't as if she didn't have enough to do. Vadim was busy training the IOTC girls. The painters were being watched over by the Kerbal sisters. Professor Warwick had something so bizarre in mind that it didn't bear talking about, but Indara and Adam thought it had merit. Well, Adam did. She'd never seen Indara at work before, and the contrast between her personal life and public persona was instructive. Like my trip out. The trip to the palace had come off without incident, more or less. Desi didn't like her new haircut and complained about having her bangs cut every so often, though it made them look like the spitting image of one another. She looks better that way. The thought stole truculently into her mind, and she groaned. Thought meant waking up. Her bed seemed to have developed its own gravity well, and she lay at the bottom of it, unwilling to leave. The trip out to the palace had been fine. The plan, once they got through security, had worked. Desi pulled the disguise off perfectly well until getting to her rooms, and there was no way she was going to fool Lady Wakama. The subterfuge had given her what she really wanted, a chance to slip away to the hidden terminal and access the Imperial archives. Sure, she could have just walked into them as Princess Kalira and made her request to the staff, but that would have meant them knowing, answering a lot of questions and word getting around. Maybe. The archivists were discreet, but it wasn't like she was considered an adult. A private search avoided all that. Maybe it was just that she enjoyed the privacy. She never really appreciated it before coming to the academy, and after she graduated and entered public life as Princess Kalira, she'd had precious little. The idea of using the hidden terminal had appealed to her. She groaned at the memory. The passageway through the bowels of the palace were a slice of purgatory, the stuff of nightmares. They had to be, to wind through all the intervening architecture and get you from A to B without being seen. But it wasn't like they were easy. The room holding the archive terminal was close to the servers, and tied in without a lot of awkward questions. But the climb down the ladder felt like a trip into the deeps. While the trip had been a success, it had been mentally exhausting. Someone had to have done that on purpose. Wakama installed the terminal, but I bet it was just an upgrade. The archives are ancient. She was thinking in complete sentences now, but drew in a long breath, still unwilling to open her eyes. She had what she'd come for. Maybe. 16 files were there on her omnipad, but they weren't small, and that had meant asking for help. And Desi was already willing to advise. That meant asking, and while Desi said yes, she'd reluctantly admitted her homework was getting pretty thick. Of course, that also meant keeping Agent Davari from having a stroke. Fine, clearance was an issue, but what good was being a princess if you couldn't delegate? Desi wasn't vetted for mauve clearance, but in the end, it was a ruling by fiat, and Davari had no option but to comply. It was a matter of trust. It had also been a long, long trip home, and talking with Desi until past midnight once they got in. That said, they all had a lot of work to do. The IOTC girls were spending half their day for a week learning to be waitresses, providing purple service no less. Mr. Desari had closed his restaurant for a week, and Vadim Note to self, find a way to reduce work. That wouldn't be easy with the war game. There was a lot of extra credit on the line. All the girls wanted to win. There were even bets, an audience. After the hack job Professor Barai made of their test, everyone needed to win, to one degree or another. What if everyone wins? That would drop our work for the week. What had Professor Warwick said about the banquet? Changing the conditions? This wasn't just war, it was politics, though on the minute scale of just one planet. They were playing chess, sacrificing their people for advantage on the board. Like chess. How could everyone win? She lay there picking at the thought. It could work as long as... The alarm on her omnipad went off, and she blearily opened her eyes with a sigh. Bed hair. She reached up, drawing it back from her eyes. She looks better without bangs. Breakfast. Melondi pushed herself to get out of bed by a feat of willpower alone. According to Lady Wakama, it was the most important meal of the day. She was still dead tired, and just at the moment, it felt like a penance. Dropping into her seat, she cast her gaze across the people around her. Their cozy table for 12 was getting cramped, with 15 and sometimes 16 people crammed together. Today there were 14, including her. When Desala and Nessa joined, there'd been plenty of room. While that filled the table to capacity, it also made for some awkward meals. There'd been more than a little bickering along the way, but she'd heard far worse watching her mother. There were times when being an empress seemed to mean doing as she pleased. That was the public image, but the reality was working with her friends and trusted advisors to handle an endless parade of people with personal agendas, gripes, complaints, and problems. While her mother had worked hard as empress to develop peace and foster greater prosperity, she missed her time in the military when she could cut through the crap. With her sister's death, everyone with any sense was wondering if there was going to be a sea change once the time of mourning was done. She wondered herself. Of course, no one minded when Bree joined their table. Lark had occasionally looked ready to gnaw her hand off to escape, but what started out as an uncertain partnership with Bree had eventually settled out. It wasn't unheard of for women to partner up to go looking for a man, after all. A stray thought broke her reverie, and she grinned. I wonder how the professors got on with their honeymoon. As a Dev's head commando, Captain Solani Tonis was used to life in a barracks. You took care of your duties and you took care of your pod. In between, there was time for your own life, or a reasonable facsimile. There were only so many times you could lose yourself in working out. Racking out and watching movies was welcome, but as you got older, it sucked doing it alone. That was part of making rank, though. Sure, you got your own quarters, but it erected a barrier between you and your girls, even if it was there for a reason. Holding rank meant that you had the moral authority to be in command, and sometimes that meant if the mission was going to succeed, you had to give orders that meant someone didn't come back. Separation meant that you burnished that image with a veneer of distance, but it also meant you got attached to your pod, but not too attached. You developed a good working relationship with the people in your pod, but you could never put that separation totally aside. It made for some fucking lonely nights. Hanging out with the other officers was only a limited relief. You were an officer full-time and everyone judged your work as you judged each other. Besides that, Dev's head commandos weren't just Marines with fancy gear and special training. It was a lifestyle, and you stayed sharp as knives. Only the Glaives had a better reputation, but they had all the political and spit-shine nonsense to deal with as the ceremonial guard. Only the Glaives had a better reputation, but they had all the political and spit-shine nonsense to deal with as a ceremonial guard. Better off without that nonsense. Of course, while you were keeping yourself separate, that didn't mean your girls weren't taking an interest in you. As she filed out of the kitchen with her breakfast tray, Pod 5 was there having breakfast and chatting boisterously with the girls from Pod 8. Captain Sitar was there with Lieutenant Tala, sipping from her favourite mug. The normally laconic veteran was perpetually tired, irascible, and battle-weary. And as Salali rounded the corner, the shit-eating grin on her face was unmistakable. Sitar arched an eyebrow and waved at the chair next to Tala. The conversation at Podfire's table tapered off into silence. "Well?" Sitar smiled and waver. "Jelk isn't talking yet. So? Spill it." Malondi looked around the table as she pondered how to start the conversation rolling. If this was going to work, everyone needed to agree now, before class. All it would take would be someone not agreeing up front, and the whole thing would fall into a negotiation. With him there, it could all fall apart, but presented as a finished argument, that was something else. As she looked around the table, something seemed odd. She couldn't place it. She'd only been gone a day, though. Glancing over at Desi was no help. For once, she looked as tired as Malondi felt, and was frowning thoughtfully at her omnipad. Engaged to be engaged now, Belda looked as happy as Malondi had ever seen her, and had every right to be thrilled. She was locked in an animated conversation with Sephir and Pris. "Goddess, I pray, please spare me from mourning people." Zinchiki had slipped one hand over the platter between her and Desi. There was one sausage left, and "That's mine," Desi growled. Hearing her advisor actually growl about anything spoke volumes about her state of mind. While wandering for the labyrinth below the palace had been trying, Desi hadn't said much about her trip. She looked up from her omnipad. "Keep your paws off." "It's mine." The peasant extended one claw, nudging it. "I touched it. It's mine." Desi slowly leaned forward, before her tongue shot out, snapping it off the plate into her mouth. She chewed elaborately and swallowed. "Mine." "Tazien herashtinit," Zinchiki muttered at the empty plate. "Also, ik." Deshin sniffed. "Hiskeving thut." The Pezrin blinked, her Asaic flickering. "I am not a flaming umbrella." Detent marched on, and Mel looked down along the table. Letzi and Nessa were both tucking into their breakfast quietly, though the latter was making occasional conversation with Lark and Bree. That left Desala, who was sitting at the end of the table beside Jaxme. They were sitting opposite the twins, who were... How are they both awake? You need to get a gravity polarizer to get Lynn out of bed, and are they blushing? There didn't seem to be any polite way to ask. Thankfully, Jax saved her the trouble, setting down her glass. "You didn't... I mean, seriously." Jack's exclamation caught everyone off guard, and conversation slowed around the table. "Things just happened," one of the girls shrugged, and the pair blushed even deeper. "What things?" Belle looked up from her plate. "What did I miss?" Desala rolled her eyes and shook their head with a put-upon look. "Our resident geniuses have been advancing their interests." "It's not like that," one of the sisters hissed insistently. "We just escorted Dr. Painter Forsyth back to the hotel." "Back to their rooms," the other one nodded, sitting up. "Dr. Forsyth Painter was there with Professor Zarin. And when we got there, they were, well, already sort of relaxing." The first sister nodded. Without one of them being nearly comatose in the morning, it was impossible to tell them apart. "It was perfectly innocent," the second said firmly. "After all, it would have been rude to make a scene," the first carried on. "We broke in on them, and we didn't want anyone embarrassed. I mean, we have internships." Zephyr swallowed her drink and set her cup down. "You broke in on them in the bedroom?" "No, of course not," the nearest twin shrugged. "It was sort of in the living room." "Halfway," her sister added with a nod. "Oh, I suppose." The first twin stifled a yawn, before shrugging sheepishly to her sister. That was probably Lynn. "So, You two played hide the spaceship with 2 males and only 1 other woman? But they're, older. Lark's protest trailed off. It wasn't like that. Probably Kamara shifted uncomfortably. Oh, yeah, we were trying to tell you, Jax. Caslin perked up. We had to sign one of the calendars first. Jaxme paused before sipping her drink and canted her head slowly to one side. One of our bikini calendars? Oh, yeah. Marion and Mr. Ayan showed up too, Lynn burbled happily. They said they're selling really well and, hey, ew! Pfft. Jaxme gave a breath. Wait, you did what? With my aunt's co-wife and 3 guys? The explosion of juice from Jaxme wasn't the worst thing she'd seen all morning. Goddess love her, but Desi snaking the sausage probably still took the prize. Besides, it had an eloquence all its own. The twins dabbed each other off with a napkin. Both were still blushing, but Lynn, probably, looked insufferably pleased, while her sister canted her head. Is that all right, Jax? I mean, I had no idea my aunt was that cool, Jax whispered, staring at her plate without seeing it. Her and 3 guys. 4. Don't forget that guy Stace. Probably Lynn offered. Oh, probably Kamara nodded sagely. They talk about him a lot. 4. I mean, my mother's said my uncle... Jaxme said woodenly, staring at her breakfast without really seeing it. I have got to get to Earth. I'm going to be the last one here to get laid. Nestor sighed dolefully, breaking the silence. I just know it. Hey, where did my sausage go? Solani had weathered worse than this before. Good-natured ribbing was all part of the job. It kept morale up. It promoted unit cohesion. Most of the time it was just fun. But right now, it made her feel old. As she sank into her chair atop, she waved her mug at Kalani and Vaco. Running her eyes over the board, she saw that they'd already run a system check for the shift start, and the objective was having breakfast. At the top of the hour, she'd head toward class. Pod 5 would come in for shift change, and she could head to bed and pretend she could sleep. Maybe she could. She hadn't last night, and exhaustion might lend a hand, though after the grilling the girls had given her in the mess hall, she wasn't so sure. She should be happy right now. Bragging. She'd won Miv and Leia's approval. She had a date. If this were a nop, she wouldn't have planted her flag and called it a win, but she'd at least been thinking about breaking it out. Why did she feel worse instead of better? Everything all right, Captain? She glanced to her right, where Vaco was sitting. The girl smiled weakly and shrugged apologetically, canting her head. It's just, you've kind of looked like 9 miles of bad road all shift long. Am I not hiding it, or is my pod learning to read me that well? Her girls had both seen a tour since commando school. They'd both proven themselves the hard way. The really hard way to get picked up for this assignment. But they were both so young. She liked her girls, and they'd worked up together when they were assigned to her. They were complacent, but young. Sometimes it felt like the gulf between them felt very wide. She offered a shrug in reply, not looking behind her to Kalani, who'd been playing with that silly cube when she got back. The sound of her constantly twisting at it was gone now, but if she looked, then she'd know she was being stared at. Just thinking, she offered nonchalantly, sliding lower in her chair and crossing her arms. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Vaco glancing back at Kalani, before looking back to check over the board. There was a whisper of air from the vent and the almost inaudible sound of the equipment, but otherwise the room was quiet. They aren't buying it, and why should they? Just thinking sounds lame. As if I could think. I had to leave the room instead of watching Tom get up. She hadn't watched him sleep. There wasn't any need for it in the evening routine, which mostly focused on coordinating the ground paths and checking the perimeter, and she didn't want to tempt herself. It had been quiet all night, which usually gave her time to think. But I don't know what to think. Solani wanted to hug herself tighter and force herself to uncross her arms. I suppose Jelks told you about our trip? Not much, Captain, Kalani said. Just bits. It sounded like, well, we're wondering why you don't look happy. And that was it, wasn't it? She had a date, therefore she should be happy. When you were younger, going out and hitting a bar meant maybe finding a guy, trying to catch his attention. And maybe if you were really lucky, you might get more than blowing your pay in a hangover. But that was probably it. It meant blowing off steam between bumps on a ship and waking up after a few laughs. It meant weekend passes before getting called in and hoping you got a guy's phone number. And mostly it meant seeing people around you that you never have the time to connect with. It meant a lot of hangovers. Tom was there on one of the small screens right now. He finished dressing and was making breakfast for himself and Miv. I haven't had breakfast with my family since I left home. I haven't spent time like that in years. The objective was up on the main screen, talking with her friends. She was getting on with her life, having fun, or at least looked like it most of the time. Looking at Tom and Miv made her ache. That was what a normal life looked like. A couple of women and their guy sharing a morning. And I'm hiding in a bunker watching. I'm buried here so deep that I can barely feel my heart beating. What would I even say? She tried to remember the last time she'd had a date. It had been a while. Boys were scarce, but they got a lot scarcer when they became men. Married men, with wives and families and children. When she'd been Vaco's age, going out to the bar meant living on hope, and maybe meeting someone there with a guy. At her age, it meant being an outsider. Old before her time, even when the rank came off, and she didn't know anyone there. Not being one of the girls anymore. It meant being the odd one out. Despite herself, she looked at the camera, watching Tom and Miv. Tom was drinking his coffee and laughing about something while Miv ate. She was glad it was on the small screen. The sight was bad enough without any sound. I want to stay with you, she whispered almost inaudibly. Captain? Vaco asked. Sorry, I didn't catch that. I have a date. The silence was painful. At least she could tell them what they already knew. Something safe. I'm just giving a lot of thought to what to do. How to get to know him. Come on, Captain. You already know him. Just let him get to know you. Vaco waved at the monitor. Don't be so hard on yourself. I mean, if you have a date, Miver and her co must have approved. I bet you'll be carrying him off over your shoulder in no time. It's not just that. I mean, it is. I do have their approval. I just don't know what to say to him. She looked down, refusing to wince, but wasn't sure when she'd crossed her arms again. How can I explain knowing everything about him? He'll hate that, and I'll sound like a stalker. Come on, ma'am. He's ex-military too, Vaco grinned, and he's pretty bright when he isn't being dense. Solani gave her sergeant a pained look that was so old-fashioned it could be part of the fossil record. She was about to say something when Kalani coughed and glared. What Vay means to be saying is that he'll probably understand. It did save their lives. Us, watching, I mean. Yeah, that is what I meant. Miv says it now and then. Sorry. Vaco bit her lower lip anxiously, but rallied. Anyway, just tell him about yourself. You probably have all kinds of stories we haven't heard yet. It's not like he hates the military. He wore his old uniform and everything. Just flex my pecs and tell him war stories? Solani thought about the weight of experience in trying to explain. She nodded at the little screen where Tom was cleaning up in the kitchen. I think he wants something more. I just don't know how to put that across. Why not music, Captain? He loves music. Kalani opined matter-of-factly. Maybe an old favourite. That isn't a bad idea. There is a whole library of human music right on my doorstep. Solani ran her thoughts over the idea. It would speak to him in a language he understood. Maybe find a human man singing? Would that be more or less threatening? Maybe she could do some searches. Really make her case? Out of the mouth of babes. Hey, yeah. One of my podmates in training told me all about one called My Milkshake Brings All the Boys to My Yard. Vega was nodding enthusiastically. Oh! There's one called My Humps. She's right, Captain. Kalani beamed. Just put yourself out there and stick with something classy. One of the many lessons she'd learned in growing up, and as Kalira there had been many, was the importance of picking your moment. It was a vital skill that saw you through the most difficult situations, and could turn disaster into success. The important thing was that sometimes you had to help people make up their minds by convincing them it was their idea in the first place, and doing so meant guiding a conversation carefully to a point where you could do just that. Alright, it hadn't helped with the Rakiri delegation and the carrion, but it wasn't that kind of lesson. Vatica was as useful a tool as could be. After all, it was their language, so it was the tool. Though her mother had occasionally remarked that she envied the Helcom. Their language had an indefinite polarity objective sort of thing that was kept at the end of every sentence. That way, someone could announce something like, "We're going to charge up that hill into a battery of laser cannons," and after giving the speaker a chance to see how things were going down with their audience, they had the option to add, "not." Of course, with the news on the table from the twins, Jaxmi having conniptions about calendar sales, Belder trading quips about humans, thoughtful laughter about Professor Pelavon's weekend, and another plate of sausages, it was time to get down to business. She raised her voice just a bit. It was enough to be heard around the table, but there were still one or two IOTC girls in the room and all the rest of the students. Everybody, can I have your attention for a minute? I need to talk to you about the sim today. Desala had made peace by returning with the sausages, and was busy getting the platter away from Zenshiki, but she glanced over at that. I thought this was like... the brown stuff. We don't talk about it, right? I know, but I've got to. It's important. Because of the other stuff? She said, as significantly as she could, without raising her voice. The more natural you sounded, the more people wouldn't pay attention, at least in the right setting. You know, this coming shell? That's fair. Belle set aside her papaya. What's on your mind, Mel? Well, we're all going to be really busy, and we need to go over things for this shell. And stuff? Desi said archly. Some of us have some stuff, Mel nodded, but we all have other classes too. We all want the extra credit for this sim, right? I think, if we lay it out right, we can all get the 200 points. That got their attention, though Pris was the first to speak. Okay, you have our attention. What's your idea and what's the catch? Catch? If it's too good to be true, the professor probably won't buy it. I mean, we can't just all declare victory. Even if we wanted to, he set the victory conditions. Pris waved a hand airily. I wouldn't mind. Nesra and I have a test this week in economics. That got thoughtful nods around the table. It was a gentle reminder that while they kept their secret, everyone had their own lives too. All right, I have an idea. The thing is, we all have to agree to it, going in on this turn. If any of us back out, it won't work. You mean they win and the rest of us lose? Lexi asked so softly she almost missed it. Yeah, I think so. That was the bad part about this, and she'd hoped no one would ask. Kind of sounds like the Traitor's Dilemma, Lark nodded. Printy told me about it. When? Bree spoke up with an effort to sound casual. We talk. Anyway, the point is, if everyone goes along, we all win a bit, but there's no telling if someone wants to stab you in the back. She held up the fork. It's like a lot of plover for one person all at once, or everyone gets a bit of plover over time. Eek. Melondi tried to ignore the look of distaste Zenshiki was giving the fruit, and pressed ahead. She's right, but if we do this, together, we can all win. It's like this. Tom looked out over the class. studied the audience, and tried to gauge what was going on. Does not compute. Danger, Will Robinson. It wasn't that the girls weren't being perfect angels. It was more that they were. Sure, 5 or 6 girls from the IOTC group were chatting boisterously when he walked into the room. They settled respectfully, but it was the sort of behaviour that was normal for them, from his little experience of what the IOTC considered normal. His girls, on the other hand? There had to be something in the water of the Shilvanti gene pool. No whispers, no conversation. All 12 girls were looking at him with pleasantly bemused smiles. He looked over at Zenshiki. Her expression was as neutral as ever, though she tucked her Asayak away, hidden from view. At first, he tried to put it out of his mind. They probably wanted to ask about the honeymoon. We should make Q&A time at the end of class interesting. He still wasn't quite sure what to think about the whole thing himself, and the realization that there was probably a camera looking in on him now didn't help. Smile for Solani. Is she awake this time of day? With nothing for it, he started into a recap of events. It was unfamiliar territory, as Miv usually started every class. At least I have real coffee. The impression wouldn't go away, though. The girl's smiles and attention to every word was almost surreal. Okay, so today I have the Stepford Chill. Still nothing. He wrapped up the recap, set up the map on the screen, and asked the girls for their orders. Tom looked at the sets of orders on his omnipad, passing them out into individual sheets. After going through it the first time, he made a second pass. There was no way the game program would accept it, but that didn't make the orders invalid. Would the French have bought it? Maybe. The orders on the table sort of removed the choice. The guards were all still busy arming themselves to the teeth, but the orders were clear. France under Sephir and Pris would accept the consequences or face a collective invasion by all the other powers. It was peace in their time. Instead of falling back, everyone got something except the French, who had their colonial possessions carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. Germany lost its Pacific holdings but was given Madagascar. Japan took over Indochina along with England. The US gained some islands. Austria-Hungary, Italy and the Ottomans split up parts of the Balkans where they had troops, while French colonial Africa. Everyone gained something except France. Would the Shield see France becoming a monarchy as a victory? Probably. The French army had been on the verge of mutiny. If peace was the alternative, it was possible. That didn't mean just accepting this. From the look in the gallery, the IOTC girls are waiting for the battle to continue. Well, this is an interesting solution, but since it's completely political, and you all agree, who's going to defend it to me? Hands were already going up, and Tom pondered who came up with the idea. It had Melondi, Desi and Jax written all over it, though Pris had a flair for this kind of thing in her papers. Zenshiki was coming out like a rose. Could she convince everyone else to call it quits while she hadn't lost a thing? Possibly. It was like a locked room mystery, and they all looked guilty as sin. Pris, explain this to me, please. Tom struck out, nodding at her. Give it to me in your own words. Why should I accept this declaration of universal victory? Sir? Pris looked at the others a moment, and after some general whispers, stood up. It was a habit he tried to dispense with, but he let it go, since he put her on the spot. Well, sir, on page 2, there's a list of all the exchanges and colonial possessions. The rules stipulate that the winning team displays the most gains. It does. So why shouldn't I decide France is the biggest loser, and award the gain to the Central Powers? Because they get to reform as a monarchy, under the auspices of the Allies, and, if you look at page 5, that's where the marriages are outlined. That's where Sephir and I form a new royal family, our kids marry into England, Germany and Russia, and we become a protectorate of all three. France was almost always a kingdom or empire. We looked it up, and everyone decided that putting the situation back to normal was the best for everyone. Just like that? It was peace in their time, Shulvanti style. Yes, sir. We were all losing a lot of troops from attrition in a very even race. We all sort of knew that. It made more sense to stop while we could. And turn in orders where you all keep arming to the teeth? And what about the NPC countries? What does Serbia get out of this? He countered. After all, there was no reliable intelligence that they caused the assassination. Yes, sir, but their country's been devastated. Kellogg has revised her conditions for a diplomatic solution. That's page 8, and all the major powers will endorse it. She grinned at him sheepishly, but her bearing was poised. Including France. We're even willing to dispatch some of our nobility to help with the problem of an heir for luck. The fighting's been kind of rough on the nobility all around. Tom sighed. It wasn't the takeaway he'd been after, but politics was the art of the possible. Sometimes teaching it had to be too. And the attrition with your people. If I accept this, you have to understand that the Allies were on course to win the war. While both sides did it, the Central Powers made an even worse habit of using their social elite to fill the role of specialized troops, like pilots or the officer corps. He wasn't called the Red Baron for nothing. Tom stopped himself. He hadn't gone into von Richthofen because explaining the concept of a Freiherr would probably either take 5 minutes or a whole day, and he was betting on the latter. My point is that when attrition you're seeing started to bite hard, the Allies had a cadre of trained and capable troops, and the Central Powers didn't. That was true as far as it went, and it was a good part of why the Japanese lost the air war in the 40s, burning through their experienced personnel, and the tank ran empty. But that was something for another sim, and he'd already planned to give them all the credit anyway. Right. This is unconventional, but I am giving you this one. It will not be an acceptable solution for the sim in the 1940s. Tom saw the smiles erupting across the class and ignored the IOTC girls, who were struggling not to interrupt. At least he had 20 years and as many classes to figure a way around the sneaks. They will be awarded after you watch the file titled, They Shall Not Grow Old. I want that to be acknowledged by the day after tomorrow, when we'll start on the sections for the Roaring Twenties and the Lost Generation. Any questions? Tom watched as the hands went up. This hadn't been what he'd expected, but it was one way to get his semester back on track. Now all he had to do was survive a weekend. It was all good, as long as no one got put up against the wall and shot. They had the win. Melondi smiled along with the others and congratulated herself for a moment. It had been a good simulation. Useful. She'd learned a lot, and more about her classmates and Professor Warwick than she'd expected. They were her friends, yes, but they were also gifted. With their help and the sanctuary of the Academy, she might survive the next few weeks until the court returned, and her mother could take things in hand. In the meantime, she had her friends. As frightening as she was, she had Agent Davari. She had 8 pods of Death's Commandos. When they weren't hunting Satora's killer, she had Indara and Adam and their co-wives. She had the girls of the IOTC. She had Vadim. And she had Professor Warwick. It was enough to get by, and if they could get the proof she needed, it would mean justice. The thought of Satora's death rose in her thoughts accusingly. Well, some justice. It wasn't a perfect situation, and it wasn't a perfect solution, and as she sat there the class weighed in her thoughts. She raised her hand and waited. Professor Warwick called on her after answering a question about the next sim. Yes, Melondi? Sir, you said something about reserves? How one side had specialized reserves and the Allies were more broad? I'm sorry, but could you explain that a bit more? Warwick nodded. Sure. It was a social distinction in World War I, and later we can discuss it during the classes on World War II. The Allies tended towards selecting specialized troops based on ability rather than social class. It wasn't universal, but the Central Powers and later the Axis powers veered towards selection by status. When casualties started taking a bite out of those specialized troops, the Allies were the ones with a trained pool of capable reserves to fall back on, because their pool of recruits wasn't constrained in the same way. She nodded and took her hand down. The lesson seemed implicit, as she felt more than looked at the IOTC girls behind her. The Empress had done a lot to curb the power of the interior, but it was still very present, and though she loved the military, she still made use of the ministry. I have a handful of people helping me against my sister, Camordri, who has an entire palace and years of experience. If I want more options, I need to broaden my scope. Somehow. Desala took up the question. Sir, with respect, Shulvanti nobility isn't like yours. Sure, eldest daughters have an advantage in inheriting, but that's not a given. It's not like we just inherit a title without any effort. Isn't there a chance things would have worked out? There was a chance, but it didn't, Warwick nodded. And we aren't talking about now. Your wars of consolidation were pretty brutal too. So while a different outlook helped, was it enough, or did it just delay the problems? Then or now, sir? Desala didn't seem ready to give up the point, and Melondi turned her thoughts to the questions. Then. Now is sort of obvious since the nobility is here. Warwick waved a hand at them all and smiled. But then, during your wars of consolidation, it was a similar phenomenon. She had 8 pods of Marines, 30-odd IOTC girls, her friends, and 1 human. Maybe that was enough for now, but she did need nobles who were friends, or true believers. She needed both. But if the interior were true believers, shouldn't they believe in more than self-interest? And how to make that work in the future? If she had a future. Right. No sim this afternoon, and read File 21 and Chess Club the day after tomorrow for anyone that wants to come. Enjoy the day off. The girls filed out, talking amongst themselves. In a thoughtful frame of mind, he watched them go before gathering up his bag. Life was back to normal, at least for another day or two. Was it really all that different? By the time the Shulvanti landed, only 1 in 200 Americans knew a veteran well who had served themselves. Maybe that was different in other nations, but that was the reality he'd known. Military service had become a niche existence, where the man on the street thanked you for your service with fuck all idea what that meant. It had been frustrating as hell when the hypocrites didn't give a damn about the VA. Until 9/11, generations of Americans never had to look up and wonder if the plane in the sky might not be friendly. But supporting the troops only meant big military spending to buy the shiniest toys. Most of that money lined the pockets of defense contractors, while the US took terrible care of its vets. And then Shulvanti arrived. Sometimes life held up big fucking mirrors. Tom looked at the door to the classroom and considered what he'd just learned out of all the sim. Depending on the source and context, humans had only known 200 or 300 years of peace in the last 3,000. Humans might see peace as an absence of war and a time to rearm, but the Shulvanti saw peace as a byproduct of war. They gloried in their military. The problem was they were so good at building up to be ready that they had long periods of peace. Constant warfare sounded worse than long periods of peace, but when war came, it would mean lofty expectations watered down with inexperience and fertilized with vast quantities of weapons. Small wonder the Shulvanti military is courting humanity. Fuck. Yeah. We kind of did it to ourselves, but we do kick ass because of nature. Nurture? Or both? Sometimes measuring quantity versus quality sucked. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but maybe the rules could be changed. Tom looked around the empty classroom. There was probably a camera somewhere, but it didn't matter. Abstractions over the next big boom could wait. Right now, his schedule was clear. Mick Jagger was crooning through his head and everything was fine. Hey, think the time is right For a palace reveller. His omnipad pinged, and he glanced at the message. An afternoon appointment with Ganya? He shrugged. Probably something about Miv. What's the worst it could be?